Okay, so you know all this material you send over about AI agents and how to build them and even how to sell these things.
Hmm.
It's really fascinating, this idea that they are basically like digital employees who can kind of take on all these routine tasks.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, things that we probably spend way too much time on.
Absolutely.
So I really want to make sure that in this deep dive, we get a really solid grasp on what are these AI agents all about?
Right.
How are they actually built? And then all these different ways that people are using them.
Absolutely. And I think the material you've shared is really great for that.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think it highlights right from the start
Mm-hmm.
is that there's this kind of core simplicity
Okay.
to the technology. And we're going to kind of unpack that and show you
Yeah.
how they're fundamentally designed to
Yes.
understand what you tell them and then take action to get things done.
Right.
And it's that core principle that unlocks so much potential.
Exactly. And we're going to go on this journey where we go from that really basic definition of what an AI agent is. Yeah.
And this idea of tools, which are so important, to
Mhm.
actually seeing them in action, across these different no-code platforms.
Yeah.
And we'll look at everything from, having them directly talk to customers
Mhm.
to totally automating processes
Absolutely.
that are happening in the back end of a business.
For sure.
But importantly, what I really want to do is make sure that we distill all of these concepts
Yes.
into really clear insights.
Yes.
So, no one's getting bogged down in the details or unnecessary complexity.
Absolutely. We want to make sure we're extracting that essential knowledge.
Yeah,
So you've got a strong understanding without getting lost in the weeds.
exactly.
So let's start with the absolute basics.
Okay.
What is an AI agent?
All right, so let's unpack the material that you sent over. I mean, it really emphasizes this idea that
Mhm.
an AI agent is something that understands the instructions you give it and then executes concrete actions to achieve that outcome.
Yeah.
But here's where things get really interesting.
Mm.
They aren't self-contained.
Yes.
They really heavily rely on what are called tools.
That's a key point.
And I think a good way to think about this is, just like a human worker needs specific tools for their job.
Yeah.
You think about a mechanic, they've got their wrenches and, their car lift.
Absolutely.
If you're a writer, you need your laptop, you need your research materials.
Yeah.
AI agents also need the right tools to be able to do their job.
That's a really good analogy. And
Yeah.
for AI agents, these tools are functionalities that allow them to interact with the digital world.
Okay.
So it could be a tool that allows them to search the web for information,
Okay.
a tool that allows them to work with and manipulate data in a spreadsheet,
Mm-hmm.
or even a tool that can write an email or send an email.
Yeah.
And I think a key insight here is that the more tools an agent has access to, the
Yeah.
more adaptable and capable it becomes.
Right. So more tools equals greater problem-solving capability.
Exactly.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah. So there was this really good example in the material that I thought we could dig into.
Yeah.
It talked about this AI agent, and it was given the task of, identifying all these AI startups
All right.
that had raised money recently,
Yeah.
and then organizing all that information into a spreadsheet
Yeah.
with a brief summary for each of them, and then emailing a link to that spreadsheet.
Absolutely.
So walk us through, how would an agent actually break that multi-part task down using
Oh,
its tools?
Yeah. So when faced with a task like that,
Yeah.
an intelligent AI agent, what it would do is it would decompose that
Okay.
into a logical sequence of individual steps.
Okay.
And it would use the appropriate tool at each stage.
Mm-hmm.
So initially what it would need to do is it needs to find those startups.
Right.
So it would use what we'll call a web searching tool.
Okay.
And it would formulate a really specific query that's designed to find companies
Right.
that meet the criteria.
Okay.
Once it's got a list of potential candidates,
Yeah.
it would then access its spreadsheet tool.
Okay.
Create a new spreadsheet and start populating that spreadsheet
Right.
with the name of each of these startups, in a row in the spreadsheet.
Got it. So it uses web search to locate the information.
Yes.
Spreadsheet software to then organize it.
Absolutely.
What happens after that?
So the next stage is to actually summarize the key aspects of each of these startups.
Okay.
So it might go back to its initial search results.
Okay.
It might actually click through to the company's websites.
Mm-hmm.
It might even go back and use that web searching tool again
Okay.
to find out more details about their recent activities
Right.
or funding announcements.
Mm-hmm.
And once it's gathered all the information for each company,
Yeah.
what it'll do is it'll use an internal summarization tool,
Okay.
which is essentially an AI model that's trained to condense textual information
Okay.
into a brief overview.
Right.
So it could create that overview
Yeah.
and put that into the spreadsheet as well.
Okay.
And then the final stage is to actually send you the link to that spreadsheet.
Yeah.
So it will access its email tool.
Yeah.
It will compose an email,
Yeah.
put the link to the spreadsheet in there, and then send it to you.
Oh, okay. So it's really interesting, just seeing how it breaks down that complex goal
Yeah.
into these manageable steps.
Yeah. And uses the right tool for the right job
Mm-hmm.
to search for the information,
Yeah.
organize it in a spreadsheet,
Yeah.
summarize the findings,
Yeah.
and communicate it to you via email.
Yeah. That's really powerful.
Yeah.
Okay, so earlier we touched on this idea of the brain of the agent.
Yes.
What is that crucial element that enables these agents to actually plan and adapt in this way?
So this brings us to the critical role of what are called reasoning models.
Okay.
So think of these as the core intelligence
Mm-hmm.
that drives the agent's decision-making.
Okay.
So the material specifically talks about models developed by OpenAI, like their GPT series,
Yeah.
as really powerful examples of these reasoning engines. But what's particularly interesting is their ability to not just execute individual commands,
Okay.
but to actually come up with a sequence of actions,
Mm-hmm.
execute those actions, evaluate the results,
Yeah.
and then replan if necessary.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
very similar to how humans would actually solve a problem.
That makes sense. So it's not just about robotically following instructions.
Exactly.
It's actually got this layer of intelligence that
Mhm.
allows it to think and course correct.
Yeah.
I really liked the example in the material about having a poor initial search term.
Mm-hmm.
Can you elaborate on that and how the agent uses this idea of reflection and replanning?
Yeah, so let's go back to our AI agent
Okay.
who's looking for funded AI startups.
Yeah.
And imagine its initial search query is something pretty general,
Yeah.
like, AI investments.
Right.
And that doesn't yield the results it needs.
Yeah.
Now, a less sophisticated system
Yeah.
might just give you a massive irrelevant data
Right.
or not be able to find anything.
Yeah.
But an agent with these advanced reasoning capabilities,
Mm.
what it can do is recognize that that initial approach isn't working.
Okay.
So it can reflect on the lack of results
Right.
and then replan its strategy.
Okay.
So that might involve refining its search terms.
Okay.
So it might try something more targeted, like, recent seed funding in AI.
Okay.
Or maybe it wants to explore completely different sources of information.
Right.
So it might go to specialized tech news websites
Okay.
or LinkedIn to see if it can find funding announcements there.
Okay.
And it's this ability to kind of assess how effective its actions are
Mm-hmm.
and then change its approach
Yeah.
that makes these more advanced agents so powerful
Okay.
and why they're increasingly being described as digital workers.
I love that description, digital workers. It's so apt.
Yeah.
But, the material also touched on the fact that this is still a developing technology.
Yes.
And it's not flawless. Are there limitations that we should keep in mind?
Yeah. And I think that's an important point to raise. While there's been amazing progress in the field,
Mm-hmm.
the technology isn't always perfect,
Okay.
particularly when you get to these really complex multi-step tasks
Yeah.
where there's lots of dependencies.
Right.
And the material rightly emphasizes that these agents often still need a degree of human oversight
Okay.
to make sure they're on track
Mm-hmm.
and to handle unexpected situations.
Okay.
Think of it as having a new employee
Right.
who's really capable but still learning.
Right.
They can handle a lot,
Yeah.
but you might need to check in now and again,
Right.
especially in those really complex projects.
Okay, so we're not quite at the point where we've got these fully autonomous digital workforces,
Not quite.
but the material did hint at the next stage of evolution for these agents.
Yes.
What's the near future look like?
So what we're seeing is a trend towards multiple agents
Okay.
collaborating to achieve complex goals.
Okay.
So rather than relying on a single agent to do everything,
Yeah.
we're seeing the emergence of systems where you have a central coordinating agent
Okay.
that can delegate subtasks to specialized subagents.
Interesting.
So let's say the overall goal is to generate a market research report.
Okay.
What you could do is have a main agent that assigns the task of gathering data
Okay.
to a dedicated research agent
Okay.
that's really good at web scraping
Mm-hmm.
and information retrieval.
Okay.
And then it might assign the task of writing to a writing agent
Right.
that's skilled in natural language generation
Yeah.
and, actually constructing an argument.
Okay.
And then it might assign formatting and distribution
Yeah.
to another agent.
Right.
And the material highlights that some of the big players
Okay.
like HubSpot, Microsoft, Google
Yeah.
are really actively exploring this.
Interesting.
So they're building these teams of specialized agents
Wow.
that can work together to automate these really complex workflows.
Okay, so given the limitations that you mentioned earlier about handling those complex tasks with a single agent, this idea of multi-agent systems is sort of the natural next step.
Exactly.
Okay, it's a really powerful picture, this idea of a whole digital team.
Yeah.
Now, the material categorized the real-world applications of AI agents into two main types. Can you walk us through those?
Yeah, so it makes a really good distinction
Okay.
between what it calls conversational agents
Okay.
and automated agents.
Okay.
So conversational agents are those agents that are designed to interact directly with a human,
Okay.
and they're typically used in chat-based interfaces.
Mm-hmm.
So you've probably encountered these yourself on websites,
Yeah.
customer support chatbots.
Yeah.
And the material gives some examples of how these could be used. So, on websites, in messaging apps like WhatsApp or Instagram, even
Yeah.
on the phone,
Right.
in custom apps.
Yeah.
So platforms like OpenAI's GPT allow you to build these agents that you can actually have a conversation with.
Okay.
And tools like Agentive that we'll talk about a bit later
Mm-hmm.
allow you to embed those agents into platforms like WhatsApp.
Okay.
So in all these cases, you have that real-time exchange
Yeah.
between a human
Yeah.
and the AI agent.
Right. So it's that real time back and forth.
Exactly.
Okay. So what about automated agents then?
So automated agents are a little bit different.
Okay.
They're designed to be integrated into existing processes
Okay.
without that constant human interaction.
Okay.
So these agents work in the background,
Right.
and they're often triggered by specific events or conditions.
Yeah.
And we're going to see some examples of those in the build phase of this deep dive,
Okay.
where we look at how these agents can be built into workflows
Right.
to optimize different parts of a business.
Now, before we jump into that practical building part,
Yes.
there was this really helpful recap in the material, almost like a mental checklist.
Yeah, it was a good way to kind of recap those core ideas.
Yeah. What were some of those key concepts?
So it asked some questions about, what are the key parts of an agent?
Oh.
It used that analogy of building an agent is a bit like being a chef with ingredients.
Mm-hmm.
It talked about what are the two main parts of a tool
Yeah.
and what do schemas do.
Right.
So it really encouraged the listener to kind of mentally review
Yeah.
these concepts, which are so important for developing and deploying these agents effectively.
Right. So as we move into actually seeing these agents in action,
Yeah.
we should keep in mind those core components,
Yes.
the instructions, the reasoning model, and crucially, those tools.
tools.
We're going to see how those come together in these no-code builds,
Yeah.
like making sure we've got a really solid foundation
Yes.
before we start tackling those more complex applications.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's get to the exciting part.
Yeah.
Let's actually build some of these AI agents.
Let's do it.
The material really focused on no-code platforms,
Yes.
which is so cool because it means that anyone can get involved.
Absolutely.
You don't need to be a coding genius.
No,
So we looked at 4 specific builds.
we did.
Let's start with the first one, which was the Sales Copilot built using Relevance AI.
Ugh.
What was the purpose of that agent?
So the Sales Copilot was designed to really help sales reps
Okay.
prepare for calls with potential clients.
Okay.
And it was built as a conversational agent,
Right.
meaning that the sales rep would actually interact with it
Okay.
through an interface.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea was to equip this agent with specialized research tools
Okay.
that could gather and synthesize relevant information about the company
Right.
and the prospect that they were going to speak to,
Okay.
and then generate a really concise pre-call briefing document.
Okay.
So they're super prepared going into that call.
That sounds really useful. How did it actually achieve that? What were the specific research tools?
Now, there were 3 key tools that were built within Relevance AI
Okay.
for this Sales Copilot.
Okay.
The first was a company researcher tool.
Okay.
And this tool would take a company's website URL as input,
Okay.
and it would go and scrape the content of that website.
Right.
And then it would use an AI language model, probably something like GPT-4 Mini,
Okay.
to analyze that text
Mm-hmm.
and generate a really concise summary of the company.
Okay.
So it would talk about the company's mission,
Mm-hmm.
its products and services, its values,
Yeah.
recent news and announcements.
Okay.
The second tool was a prospect researcher tool.
Okay.
And this tool was designed to take the URL of an individual's LinkedIn profile,
Right.
and it would scrape the publicly available information from that profile.
Okay.
Again, using an LLM to create a summary
Mm-hmm.
of the individual's background,
Sure.
key experiences, current role.
Yeah.
And then the third tool was the pre-call report generator.
Okay.
And this took the outputs from those first two tools,
Right.
the company summary and the prospect summary,
Yeah.
combine them together.
Okay.
And then using a slightly more strategic prompt,
Mm.
the large language model,
Yeah.
it would generate a really comprehensive pre-call report that had, insights, potential talking points
Right.
that the sales rep could use on the call.
So basically, the sales rep just gives the agent the relevant website
Yeah.
and LinkedIn URLs.
Mm.
And then the agent uses these tools in a defined sequence,
Yeah.
gathers the raw information, summarizes it effectively,
Yeah.
and synthesizes it all into this really useful briefing document.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Now, the material also mentioned that these custom-built tools within Relevance AI can actually be shared with a unique URL.
Yeah.
Why is that such an important feature?
So I think shareability is such a valuable feature,
Okay.
particularly in a business context,
Mm-hmm.
because it means that once you've built a really powerful tool,
Right.
like that company researcher,
Yeah.
you can instantly distribute that
Okay.
to team members
Right.
or even to clients
Okay.
without them needing to understand how it's built or how
Yeah.
it works.
Mm-hmm.
They just access it through a simple web interface
Right.
with that URL.
So it democratizes access to all this really powerful AI functionality.
Yeah.
You don't need to be an AI expert.
Exactly.
So for anyone listening, who is thinking about selling this,
Yeah.
the fact that you can easily share pre-built tools
Yeah.
is a massive asset.
Absolutely.
Okay, so moving on to the second build.
Okay.
This was the automated lead qualification agent using NN.
Yes.
And this one went from a conversational agent to a fully automated one.
Exactly.
What problem was this particular agent designed to solve?
So this agent was built to really streamline the process
Okay.
of qualifying inbound leads
Okay.
for a hypothetical recruitment firm called Big Boy Recruits.
Okay.
And the problem it was trying to solve is one that I think a lot of businesses face,
Right.
which is getting a ton of inquiries,
Yeah.
many of which aren't a good fit.
Mm-hmm.
And reviewing each lead manually
Yeah,
can take a lot of time.
absolutely.
It can take a lot of resources.
Yeah.
And it can take your sales team away from actually selling.
Right.
So this automated agent was designed to automate the initial research and qualification.
Okay, so how did it actually automate that process? What were the steps involved?
So the whole workflow was triggered
Okay.
when someone submitted a lead capture form,
Right.
probably on the company's website.
Yeah.
The first step in that automated process was to use a tool that we actually saw in our first build,
Oh, okay.
that Relevance AI company researcher tool.
Mm-hmm.
So once the lead submitted their information,
Yeah.
the agent would take the company information,
Okay.
things like their website,
Yeah.
and feed it into that company researcher tool
Right.
to gather those key details.
Okay.
Then the next step involved an AI agent
Okay.
actually operating within NIN.
Okay.
So NIN has this tools agent module,
Right.
and it's connected to a powerful OpenAI language model.
Okay.
And that module would analyze the information
Okay.
that had been retrieved by the company researcher
Right.
and compare it against a set of qualification criteria. So in this particular example,
Yeah.
the criteria were whether the lead was a software-based business.
Okay.
So SaaS company development agency,
Mm-hmm.
because those were the areas that Big Boy Recruits specialized in.
Okay.
And based on that analysis,
Yeah.
the AI agent would determine whether the lead was qualified or not.
Got it. So it's evaluating the lead against this preset benchmark.
Exactly.
So what happens next then?
So this is where the power of automation really comes in.
Okay.
The workflow had conditional logic.
Okay.
So different actions could be taken
Yeah.
depending on the outcome.
Right.
So if the agent decided that the lead was qualified,
Yeah.
it would trigger a subsequent workflow,
Okay.
which might involve doing a deeper analysis,
Mm-hmm.
maybe categorizing the lead, so it could be routed to the right sales team.
Okay.
So maybe they've got a team for SaaS clients and a team for development agencies.
Right.
And it might use an LLM for that classification,
Okay.
and then it would send a notification to the relevant sales team saying, hey, we've got this new qualified lead,
Okay.
and here's the information.
Got it.
But if the agent decided that the lead wasn't qualified,
Yeah.
it would trigger an email
Okay.
to be sent to the person who submitted the form,
Right.
politely letting them know that it's not a good fit,
Right.
but maybe offering to connect them with someone else.
Okay.
if possible.
Yeah.
And that email would probably be sent using AnyEn's Gmail integration.
Okay, that is so efficient.
Yeah.
Just automatically prioritizing those promising leads
Mm-hmm.
and then giving a timely response to the ones who aren't a good fit.
Yeah.
Now, the material also talked about this idea of schemas
Yes.
or instruction manuals for tools.
Yeah.
In the context of NAN, can you explain what those are and why they're important?
Yeah, so a schema is like a really detailed description,
Okay.
almost like a blueprint
Okay.
for a digital tool.
Right.
It says what the tool can do,
Okay.
what input it needs,
Mm.
what it will do when it gets that input, and what output it will produce.
Right.
And this is really important for AI agents,
Okay.
especially in these automated workflows,
Mm.
because it allows them to understand how to use a tool
Okay.
without any human intervention.
Right.
So platforms like NAN
Yeah.
rely on these schemas
Mm-hmm.
to orchestrate that communication
Okay.
between the agent
Yeah.
and the tools it needs to use.
So it's like a universal adapter for your digital tools.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it.
Okay.
It tells the agent how to plug into each tool,
Yeah.
what information it needs,
Mm-hmm.
and what kind of result to expect.
Okay, so it's all about smooth communication
Yeah,
between the agent and its capabilities.
exactly.
Okay, the third build example took us to the Voiceho platform.
Yes.
And this one was a website and phone-based lead generation customer support agent.
Okay.
So it sounds like it was designed to handle customer interactions.
Yeah, across both text and voice.
Across both text and
Yeah.
voice. Okay, so what were the key features of this agent?
So this agent was designed to provide customer support
Okay.
and generate leads
Mm-hmm.
for a hypothetical business
Mhm.
called Connor's Cleaning.
Oh.
And it did this through a website chat widget
Okay.
and a phone line.
Okay.
So it had 3 core functionalities.
Okay.
First, it could answer FAQs
Mm-hmm.
from potential customers.
Right.
And it did this by accessing a knowledge base,
Okay.
which probably had a FAQ document
Right.
about their services pricing and service areas.
Okay.
Second, it could generate instant price quotes for their cleaning services.
Okay.
And it did this using a custom tool
Right.
that we saw we could build in Relevance AI.
Mm-hmm.
That tool would take inputs like property type and size
Okay.
and use an AI model to estimate the cost.
Right.
And then thirdly, it was designed to capture lead information
Okay.
from people who got a quote and wanted to book or learn more.
So it's handling those initial inquiries.
Yes.
Providing those immediate price estimates. Mm.
And capturing those all-important customer details.
Exactly.
And it does it all through website chat and over the phone.
Yeah.
So how does VoiceFlow enable that?
So VoiceFlow allows you to build these conversational flows
Okay.
that can be deployed across multiple channels.
Okay.
So the fundamental logic of the agent,
Mm-hmm.
the welcome message, understanding the user's intent,
Right.
whether they want to ask a question, get a quote, or something else,
Yeah.
and then routing them to the right place.
Right.
That logic only had to be built once
Okay.
within VoiceFlow.
Right.
So for answering questions,
Yeah.
it would access that FAQ document
Okay.
for generating quotes.
Yeah.
It would make what's called an API call to
Right.
that Relevance AI tool.
Okay.
So it would send a structured request
Right.
with the property type and size,
Right.
and then it would receive the estimated price back
Ah.
in a defined format,
Right.
and it would then format that information
Yeah.
into a response.
Either text or spoken word.
Right.
Depending on the channel.
Okay.
The lead capture process was handled using what's called a webhook,
Okay.
which basically allows VoiceFlow to send the collected information,
Okay.
name, phone number,
Yeah.
to a third-party platform like
Yeah.
make.com,
Yeah.
which would then record that information in a Google Sheet
Okay.
so that the team at Connor's Cleaning could follow up.
Got it. So that API call, it's basically like the agent is sending a specific request
Yeah.
in the right format to that, quote, generator tool
Yeah.
to get that price back.
That's a really good way of thinking about
It's
it.
okay, cool.
Yeah.
So the key takeaway here is that the core logic and integrations
Mm-hmm.
are designed to work across both text and voice.
So you develop it once.
Yes.
And then you deploy it across multiple channels
Yeah.
to reach a wider audience.
Exactly.
That's very user-friendly.
It is.
Okay, our final build was the Agentive platform.
Okay.
And it was a WhatsApp-based customer support and lead generation agent.
Yeah. What stood out to you about that no-code platform?
So Agentive is really focused on ease and speed.
Okay.
It's built on OpenAI's Assistance API.
Mm-hmm.
And it's particularly good for deploying these agents on messaging platforms
Right.
like WhatsApp.
Right. Expert speaker.